Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Contest Prep University's Peak Intel. We are going to chat today about tracking macros and kind of what's become a controversy, Austin. Should we not track macros? Should we maybe do something else? So I want to go back and give a little historical context because I think for everybody who is coming up now, maybe in your 20s, 30s, you just simply don't know of any other methodology. And I think it's really important to understand the extremes of both positions and then how you might, find it most useful for you as a competitor. But go back to, first of all, before flexible dieting or macronutrient tracking even existed. And what people would do pre 1990 is simply follow a diet. And that can be somewhat attractive even now. A lot of people, Austin, you as a registered dietitian and coach, myself, clients often say, I just, can you just give me a meal plan? And maybe 10 or 15 years ago, because flexible dieting was so freeing and so helpful to people, coaches or other people who were advocates would say, no, 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 that's ridiculous. Don't do that. You want to be flexible. But we misunderstood in that interim that people still want some form of structure. But the antithesis of that, or the etiology of that, was that's all there was. If you were a bodybuilder in 1985, you're looking at what Lee Haney ate, and that's what you ate. You're looking at this named diet or that named diet, and that's just what you did. You did not deviate. It wasn't even a collective conscious thought in our society of diet culture. So I came along in the early 1990s, and I was not a nutrition genius by any stretch. I was a college student. I was in a pre-med program, and I just happened to be an amateur bodybuilder. And when I started talking to other bodybuilders, and they were just saying, here, follow this diet, follow that diet, it was just not something that I could even really do well because I was working 4 to 5 jobs at a time. I was in a busy school program. And so I had two things that I was able to kind of stand on and create macronutrient tracking as a methodology. One is nutrition fact panel labeling had just become a law. And so there were articles about that. It was in the news. And I thought, well, that's cool. Protein, carb, we now had an ability to, in a uniform sense, look at any food and know what's in that food. I'm also learning anatomy, physiology, zoology, biochemistry, all of that in school. And I'm competing as a bodybuilder. The other thing that I saw was, well, hey, wait a second. Weight Watchers, they allow some form of flexibility. If you have, so many points, quote unquote, then you can decide, hey, if I want a Twinkie or a salad, it's this many points. And part of their impetus for that was to teach people quality and density of food, energy balance. And so look how much more food you get to eat if you eat a higher quality food, something with a lot of micronutrition as well. And that has nothing really to do with macronutrient tracking, of course, because it was a very complicated proprietary point system. But I know that was at least in my subconscious and thinking, well, what if I actually look at this, as, this particular bodybuilder eats this much chicken, this many, whatever servings of green beans and rice and whatever. And I could just kind of reverse engineer that and look at what they're actually consuming. Then I can decide if I want different food sources, I would have that flexibility. So I did that for a few years in the 90s, just with me personally. Then I won my WNBF Pro card, and then I ended up finishing a PhD in nutrition. And, all of a sudden I'm writing for all the top fitness magazines, and I start getting inquiries to coach clients. So now it's probably the late 90s, and I'm the first contest prep coach who's making a full-time career doing that. And so, of course, my methodology was already what I was doing with my local general population clients, which was teaching flexible dieting. Before there was anything written on this as a methodology, I would sit in my office at a conference table like I am now with clients. And instead of saying, here, try the zone diet, try the Atkins diet, try this many calories, try Weight Watchers, It was, here's how many grams of protein, carbs, and fats I think would be helpful for you for all these reasons. Embedded in that is, of course, an innate amount of calories that, is I'm presupposing we need. And for all these reasons, demographically, your age, your gender, your activity level. And that was an unbelievable era where it blew people's minds, Austin, who had never heard of this. It was like, wow, I get to eat whatever I want. Like, as long as I stay in this amount of carbohydrate, and I'm teaching qualitative principles like meal timing and spacing. All of that was in my first book I wrote about that time. So there's about a 10-year run where this was so new, and I would speak at science conferences and fitness camps, and it just blew people away that they could have that level of freedom. Flash forward 20 years later, and a lot of people are finding it restrictive. Instead of freeing, they find it imprisoning, because they're like, well, now I have to like stay within these levels of numbers. Like, we just moved the goalposts from rigidity based dieting on food sources to now the numerical heuristic of that, like the amount of protein, carbs, and fat. And our focus today is, those are kind of two extremes at this point. Be super, super objective and accurate with your food tracking. It gives you all the benefits of that objectivity. Plus, it gives you the freedom. Or maybe are people just sick of it? Maybe that's last year's news and we're looking for something new. A lot of people, of course, juxtapose this with intuitive eating and just habit-based dieting and lifestyle dieting. So we have a lot of research we're going to cover today, and a lot of it's brand new because it hasn't even been around long enough to be studied. I was looking at a 2017 study in preparation for this, and they said nobody's even studied macronutrient tracking versus not. So from 2017 through now is really, it has been a proliferation of great research, but it's just really that new. And I think this is important information for people. So you are the next generation. You're 20 years younger than me. And so all of this stuff I'm talking about as a transition, you're kind of like the 3-year-old who grew up with an iPad in his crib. Like, you've had flexible dieting, you've had macronutrient tracking. Like, that's just what you came into this nutrition world, at your fingertips. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how you perceive tracking versus not tracking, different forms of tracking, and what culture and dieters are now considering when they try to decide which one is right.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to, like you said, kind of grow up around this, where I read one of the magazines, you wrote an article, and I know I've shared that story plenty of times, so I won't go down that road again, but that was the inspiration for me to kind of get into bodybuilding. And the reason I say that is because um, I didn't know where to go. I'm from South Dakota at the time. One person had recently competed and then retired, so there really wasn't anyone to talk to about bodybuilding around here. So I was prepping myself, reading articles that you wrote and other people wrote, and just kind of winging it. And then hired a coach, and that coach gave me a meal plan at the time. Because to your point, that was still very popular. That was 2009. Um, and I know flexible dieting was around obviously at that point, but just for me and where I was, it was just people were still talking about, no, just you got to do meal plans, you got to eat like this, you got to eat these foods, do that this way if you want to get lean and shredded, so on and so forth. And then obviously after having kind of a terrible experience of that, then I was like, well, let's really dive into like what flexible dieting is. And then to your point, there's stuff that you've put out, other people have put out, and I just dove into it and started to experiment myself with flexible dieting and found to have a lot better results. I think the big thing is when meal plans were so popular, it's because people just wanted to be told. And still to this day, I'm sure you get it too. Like, I still hear people, just tell me what to eat. I just want to know what to eat. Like, I'll just do it. Again, personally, for me, have been on a meal plan, and clients that I have had in the past that have just specifically want a meal plan. I've not met anybody that has just done that the rest of their life. That, there's always at some point where like, I'm just sick of these foods. I have to completely change it. Or I've seen times too where people are like, oh, I'm on a meal plan. It's just, this is too rigid. I couldn't handle it anymore. I had to just go and have some ice cream or go and have this or that. So I think there was an issue with the meal plan system there where at first everybody wants to be told what to eat. but then they're not really educated on, flexibility. They're not really educated on maybe portions to how they can fit things in within their food. So I think that's where we saw a big boom, and myself a big boom with flexible dieting. I've seen people, uh, again, start with a structured system and then kind of transition, if you want to call it a tracking light, where they're like, well, I'll start off with a meal plan, then I'll kind of start tracking things myself this way. And I think that's been, a good way for people to kind of get introduced to flexible dieting. But I think there's a time and a place for both. I personally have not seen a lot of success long term with just straight rigid meal plans, but I do think that there's a time and place. There's some people that are just not prepared for tracking. There's obsessive things that people experience, yeah, and we can talk about that later. But I guess for me, that's kind of how I've grown up around this. And the experiences that I have had with myself in flexible dieting have been positive. My clients, those that learn, because I have some new clients that come in that don't know how to track, and that's been helpful for them because then they can understand, we still want to prioritize more micronutrient, nutrient dense foods, but we can fit certain things in and not have to feel so guilty about it. Even from like the physique competitor standpoint, I talked to a lot of physique athletes about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Joe. But I think when it comes to meal planning, I know coaches that'll do meal plans for their clients throughout the whole prep. Okay. Then we get to peak week, and then it's kind of a weird hodgepodge of peak week because they're like, well, okay, I guess I'm going to eat this. I'm guess going to eat that. And maybe it's the education that I was at for school and went to. And I'm sure you're probably saying, like, I like to know all of the information. So I'm going to get you ready for a peak week, and I don't know how much protein, carbs, fats, sodium, that type of stuff that you're eating. I'm kind of shooting at the hip if I'm getting you ready for a peak week, unless the coach is calculating that on the back end with the meal plan, which some might, but from my experiences, what I've seen from other clients' meal plans, I don't think that they're doing that because they're missing quite a bit. So again, that's where I kind of find a difference from a bodybuilding perspective, where I think tracking can be helpful, especially for the coach's side of things and the client, because you have information to get the client ready for a peak week. Versus a meal plan, you might not know all of that information. You're just kind of going off more portion sizes and kind of using that, which, again, I'm not trying to get muddy with the water here, but if we're talking about weight loss, sure, a meal plan could work and tracking could work. If we're talking about bodybuilding, I've just seen more success with my clients when they track stuff because we have more information. So I kind of hope that helps, but I'll throw it back to you.
Well, we're definitely going to dive headlong into the research. Like, what does the research tell us as to who is successful and who is not? There's a clear answer. And then you also brought up psychopathology. Is there a point in time where some people, some personality types, they just shouldn't be that obsessive, quote unquote, with the numbers? It can be developmental. Maybe some people, you mentioned this, start here, high structure, increase flexibility. There are all kinds of things that make this a plan that should always increase freedom and decrease rigidity. But again, we have to know the historical context, or we're just going to fail and repeat that over and over. So let's go back to even a little bit of a philosophical mooring with nutrition. Coming out of the dark ages, so from just the turn of the common era into the 500s and maybe up to 1000 were the dark ages. Then around the 14th, 15th century started what we now know as the European Enlightenment, where science, Newton, people like that were literally figuring stuff out at a rapidly increasing level. So in the 1500s is actually, I think it was even before that, maybe around 1000 or 1200, there was a book on nutrition written. But the first really meaningful one where there was a printing press and it could be distributed was in the 1500s. And it was about health. And that was the first component of nutrition academia. Somebody wrote a book, How to Live to Be 100 Years Old. And this is in the 1500s, where like you die of old age in your 30s, unless you're lucky. And then all of a sudden, from that point on, the 1600s, 1700s, even 1800s, people started experimenting. And so there were people doing all just meat and potato type diets. Vegetarianism started around then. There was one guy who had some kind of a real gimmicky vinegar type diet, and some people were literally dying of vinegar toxicity. Um, And so just step by step by step, there were these pendulum swings between France and England and one person versus another person. Even into the Civil War, there was a surgeon general, not, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't surgeon general. He was a surgeon of the, I believe, the Northern Army. His name was like General or Colonel Salisbury. He created the Salisbury steak, and he thought to help with dysentery, diarrhea, things like that on the battlefield, people should only eat meat. There was even one guy, he was a Presbyterian minister, last name Graham, who created the graham cracker, thinking that that would decrease sexual urges. And so weird, I know, I saw that eyebrow raise, like weird things because there wasn't any true scientific foundation. It was just, well, this kind of worked for me, so it must be true. It wasn't until the early 1800s that I believe was a French physicist who created the calorie as a unit of measurement. And then about maybe 50 years later, a an American chemist kind of picked up on that, Atwater, and he started looking at that in terms of, well, maybe we can quantify food with this new, thermic measurement. And then in the 19 maybe 20s, 1930s, a physician, Lulu Peters or Peterson, I forget these names, she wrote a book on counting calories. And so all of a sudden, now we have an objective way to say, wait a second, this is how much food I'm eating. And we're not even talking about the qualitative yet, because that comes a little bit later. So then her book became a national bestseller for a few years in the 1920s on literal calorie counting. And so now guess what happened? Now we had an objective measurement that increased now the pendulum swing of people doing very gimmicky fad things. Well, who wants to count calories? And that's hard. That's confusing. Why don't you just do this? So the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, there was always a preeminent faddish diet, the cabbage soup diet, the banana diet, this diet. Of course, keto came out in that amount of time. And so we really suffered with that until flexible dieting and macronutrient tracking came along. Because now we had a way to say, okay, calories started something, and Weight Watchers picked up on that, calories, where it's like, well, let's just eat this amount of food and just divide it into these points. All of those proprietary systems fall away. Instead of being all based on marketing hype, when you say, here's an objective amount of protein, carbs, and fat that my body needs, at least in these ranges, per my goals, per my demographic variables, and now I get to decide how I want to align that with my health values, because I can eat higher quality food. I can worry about micronutrition. I can do all of that. You now have the quote flexibility to do what you want with that information. So I wanted to say all that just again as a little bit more of a background to say, if we don't have some form of objective science that we all speak as a universal language and we can all rely on for accurate information, you're just going to be lost in hanging in the wind, following the next fad to the next fad, as we historically have.
Yeah, absolutely. It, I don't want to word this. It makes sense. Just as you already described, I mean, we still see the next fad after the next fad after the next fad after the next fad because I think people maybe just aren't familiar with that objective information, that universal language that we can all speak. That's why we do stuff like this, right? In hopes that people can listen and find out what that information is. Um, and so it's tough because it just seems to be so controversial when people are talking about energy intake versus energy output and things like that. Like calories in, calories out, that just doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work. There's no way you can lose weight, and that's a made up fictitious thing. I've heard this, I've read about this online. I just can't believe it's an actual argument. Because what are these fad diets that people jump in? They're energy restrictive diets. They're putting people or kind of having people eat less, just less in a different form, right? Like keto. Well, keto worked. I lost a lot of weight. Yeah, because you probably consumed less energy than you did when you started carnivore. That I lost weight. Yeah, you stopped eating certain things. Like there's these kind of guidelines to these diets that people are like, oh yeah, I feel so much better by following these guidelines. Well, yeah, you're reducing the energy you consumed in some way or form. Most of these diets tell you to stop drinking alcohol, and if you stop drinking alcohol and doing that, you're reducing calories. You stop drinking fully loaded pop, and you start doing this, you started to consume less calories. So, there's a part of me that is laughing on the inside when people say calories in, calories out is not a thing and doesn't work. But then there's also a part of me that gets kind of sad because people just aren't or they're just misinformed, excuse me. So I think it's important to really have people pay attention to, if you're thinking about considering a fad diet, look at what it's actually telling you to do. Because a lot of times it's reducing your energy. It's just using it as a different guideline, and a lot of them end up pulling something completely out of the diet, which always makes me nervous because we know, talking about universal language, we know we need proteins, we know we need carbs, we know we need fats. We might not need as much of them if we're trying to lose weight, but we still need them. Those things have nutrients in them that nourish and fuel our body. So when we pull something out completely, like let's say we completely eliminate carbs or completely eliminate fat, like there are certain micronutrients we are now not incorporating in our diet. And some people are like, well, I'll just take a multivitamin. That's not necessarily the same thing. And some of these multivitamins are heavily mega dosed, so it's kind of wasted in my opinion. But I do see the value in certain vitamins and multivitamins when needed. But I don't want to get us off topic. That's just kind of my thoughts and stances on the whole energy system and energy balance, and where people I think are just being misguided right now. I think that's something we can definitely continue to elaborate on.
Well, here's what's funny. I was chuckling on the inside because when I brought you up to that historic point of, calories being used as a unit of measurement, and now it's being described and even written about, you took the baton and ran right into energy balance. And guess what happened in the 1920s as soon as we had that formal basis of understanding of nutrition? Along comes Francis Benedict and James Harris. Guess what they did? They created the entire understanding and field of metabolism. Say, not only, and this even happened, so there was somebody again back in the 1500s who figured out what I consume alters my weight, alters my shape, my body composition. And so there was I'll call him a scientist, probably kind of a polymath philosopher, but he would weigh himself. I don't know how they weighed themselves back then at 1500, common era. I like, what are they doing? Like filling up a bathtub and just seeing how much water they displace? Like, I don't know, stones on a scale. But anyway, he would weigh himself before and after using the bathroom, weigh himself before and after eating a meal, weigh himself before and after having sex, weigh himself before and after sleeping. And he was just fascinated that his weight changed. And he's like, what's causing this weight change? And that was the real beginning of trying to understand the metabolic mechanics of food intake. So again, Francis Benedict and James Harris, they come along and they create the first real equation. They're looking at systematically, how do we even define what person's energy needs are? What is your metabolic capacity? So they start creating algorithms and ranges in terms of, that's kind of the beginning of body mass index noting and so forth. So again, registered dietitian, these have to be, historic gods to you guys in that field. But just to launch from metabolism into what we're going to talk about next, which is the research, the outcome research. Speak for a second about why that matters objectively. If I'm just dieting intuitively, if I'm just like, well, I think I'll eat a banana instead of a donut, that seems like a good idea if my goal is to lose body fat. What are you missing when you don't have some real objective thing to hang your hat on? What, calories, energy balance, metabolism, etc.
Well, the straightforward and easiest answer to that is you can still overconsume nutritious food and still overconsume calories and not lose weight. I think that's a misconception. Like, cool, I eat fruit and salad and protein and whole grains all day long. Well, yeah, I mean, you can still eat all those things and be in a calorie surplus and not lose weight. So to answer your question objectively, it helps to understand portion sizes and control and calories because it gives you objective information if you are over or under. And again, I understand we'll get into the psychology later. Like some people, that's just an obsessive thing. And that's where, kind of the intuitive eating thing can be, or thought to be helpful for some people. But we need objective information. We need to understand if we eat less than we consume, we lose weight. Okay, well, if we know that, if we have research that shows if we eat less or I'm sorry, if we consume less than we burn, um, we can see weight loss. Okay, well, how do we go about doing that? Well, we got to look at these things called calories, and these calories have things like protein. They're in proteins, carbs, and fats. Like that gives us information to help set us up and know that we're doing things the right way. Again, even if, like you said, like some people are like, well, I'll eat a banana instead of a donut. Well, your banana could have the same amount of calories as that donut, unless you kind of know what's going on there. And if you're trying to lose weight, you're going to get some more micronutrients, which is great. But if your goal is weight loss, you might be consuming the same amount of energy. So we need to have this information to understand if we're eating too much or too little. What is our goal? How do we modify it? How do we change the portion sizes to continue? Like if we're at a plateau, whether it's building muscle or losing weight, like we need that information. So I guess that's kind of my answer to that is that it helps us succeed. It helps us set up our journey, whatever that journey is, building muscle or losing weight.
And that right there is the most important point in this whole podcast. Because I'm about ready to launch into something that's going to stretch the human brain. We know the definition of intelligence, as one cliche mantra goes, is being able to hold two opposing facts at the same time as true. How can two things that seem opposite both be true? And it has to do with context and developmental timing, your process. It's the content and the process. And so, first of all, we're talking about objectivity and how preeminently important that is. And I'll give you one little bit of data to show why that's just objectively true. In a meta-analysis of 525 studies, imagine how many subjects are in 525 studies that all look at the criteria for the study inclusion was these were people who wanted to intentionally lose weight. I want to lose body fat. And they compared tracking macros versus not tracking. Guess how many people not tracking macros who had a goal of intentionally losing weight? Guess how many people in that meta-analysis that would include tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, guess how many people lost weight? Zero. Zero. Not a small percentage less than those tracking macros, not a few fewer, nobody. Nobody loses weight. I'm going to show you some other studies that show that it is possible, and this is the opposing truth. I want our listeners to know, and I know most of you guys are competitors in physique sport and maybe even performance sport and body composition, performance, everything like that matters. And so the objectivity and the accuracy is already home base for you. We're preaching to the choir. But some of you are also coaches. Some of you also have friends and family members in the general population who want to look best and so forth. So you have to look at, even something Kevin Hall, director of one of the departments in the NIH, who is just a phenomenal nutrition researcher, he wanted to kind of look at where we stood as a culture in terms of weight gain recidivism. And so as late as 2019, he found that people who lost weight, about half of them regain it back within 2 years, and about 80% regain it back within 5 years. And these are people who wanted to lose weight and sustain that. And so we're still failing miserably. We do have, Austin, the most objective information we've ever had in all of science. Nobody is at a deficit because they just don't know how to diet. Like the information is there ad nauseum. So it's not just objective information. There has to be a sociological component, a psychological component. There are all kinds of application things we need to address. And to me, that's what goes beyond flexible dieting, which was the title of a recent lecture I did in Australia at the Sports Nutrition Association annual conference, Beyond Flexible Dieting. We're not going beyond it as in leaving it behind. That is now the objective tool, set of tools that is just foundational. Like that's what there is. This is how you measure food, macro and micronutrition, and performance in your body physiologically and aesthetically. That's not going to break. But we have to go beyond it and say, now, how do we use these tools? How do we use them most effectively? How do we get it to a place methodologically where people can succeed? So again, you are a coach. You are also a physique sport competitor, a pro bodybuilder, very successful one at that. And so how do you use these objective realities and equip people with them so that they can succeed using both structure and flexibility?
It's a great question. Uh, I mean, for most competitors that I work with, some of them they're brand new to everything. They're brand new to tracking. They're brand new to sport. So we spend the first part of it learning tracking, learning, like most of them have heard of calories, most of them have heard of protein, but they don't really know anything beyond that. So the first part of it is like we're just going to create some solid habits here, and we're gonna educate you on the subjective information, like what are calories here, what are proteins, carbs, fats, why is it important that we need them, how are we going to track them, and how are we going to adjust them accordingly to like your body transformation, your weight loss, or to get you ready for the stage, so on and so forth. And then once we've got them understanding those concepts, then it goes into like this is why you can have certain foods and make them fit within your calories and macros, but here's the other reason why we still have to prioritize nutrient dense foods, because I think that's another misconception with flexible dieting is I can eat whatever I want and lose weight, sure, but at the same time, and that's probably the dietitian me, like we can eat whatever we want and lose weight, but we still need to be fueling our body accordingly with good nutrition. We got to have that balance of both. So, and then with my more seasoned competitors, they understand this. So then it's more so of just having that conversation of, okay, here's and you were talking about the history of like weighing somebody's self, right? Like we're going to check your weight. I'm going to get some subjective information from you, and then we're going to change some objective information by adjusting your numbers and your calories, and we're going to do that, and we're going to track the history of your weight, your waist. For my female athletes, like we're going to check those things as well when it's that time of the month for them, because that is an important factor to understand and know, like where their weight and waist and things like that change around that time. And then again, we can use some of that information. We'll change the calories over time and get them ready. But where I guess kind of the rigid side can be is, and this is very interesting, a lot of times the people I work with, and I would say even myself included, when I'm deep into prep, we kind of fall into eating some of the same foods naturally because the calories have gotten so low that we choose these high volume based foods that help make us feel satiated, right? So we kind of just naturally start to form a little bit of I don't want to use the word rigid, but kind of, because we're just eating the same things that make us feel good, and we know that they fit within our numbers. And then as calories start to get a little bit higher, then people start to be a little more free with their food because they have more things that they can kind of fit within that. So I think that's kind of a comparison of how we can use objective information to tailor people to get them ready for the stage or to get them ready to lose weight, kind of how rigidity can fall into that. I know I talked about like macros light, but with the newer people, I'll sometimes just do that, like, because it gets to be so overwhelming of information for them. I'm like, let's just have you track protein, calories, and fiber. Let's just start there. It's an easy thing for them to track, and then once they start to feel comfortable with that, we talk about carbs and fats, and then we kind of go from there. But yeah, that's kind of how I've approached it differently with different people, different settings, different situations, and how rigidity fit into that.
Well, there's some interesting research. I'm glad you brought that up that we can cover. You kind of got hung up for a second tripping on the word rigidity because you wanted to use it as kind of a positive, but then you thought, well, this may be also a pejorative. We want to run away from rigidity.
Right.
So think of structure. It's just chosen structure.
Yes.
I have not competed in a bodybuilding contest in 17 years, and yet I eat the same breakfast every day, I eat the same lunch every day, I eat the same pre-workout snack every day because I choose that structure. It works for me. I rely on that because it helps my day. I don't feel bound by it. As a matter of fact, every couple of months I change one of them because I'm like, hey, I want to try this now, or I'm getting a little bored of this. Chosen structure. Uh, My definition of flexible dieting has changed this much in 30 years. Um, I'll tell you what I added. So my definition is eating the foods you want. So you get flexibility, choosing the foods you want in the amounts you need, which which points to objectivity. There's a certain amount that's going to get me there. That amount is necessary quantitatively. So I'm eating the foods I want in the amounts I need. What I've added in the last few years is to stay aligned with my health values and staying aligned with my health values. That adds the qualitative. And here's why. Joshua Green, a Harvard moral psychologist, did a famous research study that is not entirely based on food, although he even applied it to that is kind of a description. Um, think back to Viktor Frankl's work and a lot of people who were starting to investigate our volitional behavioral choices, our free will, how we make decisions, and the classic trolley experiments, like a moral decision. Would you push this person on the railroad tracks, literally murdering them to save five other people, because it flips that train track switch. And so at the moral psychology department of Harvard, they did this study thinking that objectively, because again, scientifically, we want to add known factors. They thought we're going to put people in functional MRIs and we're going to look at their brains and we're going to see what parts of their brains are active in making these moral decisions. A decision that you could classify as moral as it relates to dieting is I'm on a diet. I want to lose weight. I have this value, this intrinsic value I'm trying to build to be a healthier person. And now there's a chocolate chip cookie in front of me. Do I eat it or do I not eat it? That's now a moral question because I've stated I have this intrinsic value. And they thought, based on like our neocortex, especially the dorsolateral, frontal neocortex, which goes to those highest levels, the most refined abilities to make decisions contrary to our impulses, our biological brainstem impulses. Can we control those? And they thought surely the people who's got the most complex, most active prefrontal cortex, they're going to make the right decision because they can think their ways through it. Totally the opposite. Those people who their frontal cortices did not light up, but only their limbic system, which is all emotion, when those were on fire, those people made the right decisions that were aligned with their moral judgment. So why would that be? This is so key. If you just say, I have a goal of losing 30 pounds because I want to look great, it's very superficial, or I want to win this bodybuilding contest. That's not a real intrinsic value. You want to be the person who says, I am the person who eats healthy because I want to look this way. I want to feel this way. I want to live a better quality of life. I am the person, not I do this or I do that. It's internal. So those people who said, no, of course, like I would never do that. I don't even have to think. My brain isn't even online. I can just react because I'm not the person who lies. I'm not the person who cheats. I'm not the person who eats the cookie when I've already said that's not what's going to help my goal. This is what helps my goal. So that's what I do. I'm the person who is anchored to that intrinsic value. Tracking food, not tracking food, using intuitive based, habit based decision making. All of these are tools at our disposal, and we should be using them all to help us in whatever progressive linear consequence we want. But they still have to be tied if we want to be one of those people who doesn't regain all this weight back or find ourselves struggling, that we have simply internally become that person. So that to me is the first step of going beyond flexible dieting, where we can say, well, these structures help me, this level of flexibility helps me, but I'm going to use any tool in any situation I need because I am that person who's going to live this kind of life.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the big thing there too is when you were saying, how you say things like I am this versus I do this. I think that's something that everybody needs to even consider before starting whatever, if it's a 30-pound transformation, if it's getting ready for the stage, like I think people need to really kind of look at themselves and say like, no, I am doing this. This is, for me versus like I do this. And it's distinctly different. I mean, um, how many people, and you just explained it yourself, like have more success when they kind of identify in that type of situation. Like, no, I am doing this for me. This is, you know, helping me, or this is not helping me, versus like people that are like, no, nope, I'm going to get to the stage. I can't do this. I can't do that. It's like, I just think that there's an important thing there that I've talked to some of my clients about. Like, we have to have some conversations with ourselves and ask ourselves what we're doing this for, why we're doing this. And we should all be doing this, even if it's getting ready for a show, we should all be doing this to improve ourselves. And not just fixate on like, I want to go win this trophy or this medal. I want to just like that's cool, but we should be doing this for a specific reason. I understand when we talk about competitive things, like it's very easy to get wrapped up into that. But I think people forget that we should be doing this to live a healthier lifestyle. Now, is being like 3% body fat on stage healthy? That's an argument for another day. But the journey of, eating better, losing weight, training hard, doing those things, I think that journey gets lost by some people because they get hyper fixated on, again, a medal or a trophy or whatever. And this is coming from both of us who have competed and won medals and trophies and so on and so forth. So I think people need to get back to like, I'm doing this for me. I'm doing this to improve my health. I'm doing this because I, want to improve my health and live a healthier lifestyle, and continue to have those conversations throughout their fitness journey.
Well, even if it is performative, even if it's I want to win this motherfucking world title, like it doesn't have anything to do with my health. Am I going to be the person who can stick to my diet? Am I going to be the person who gets the cardio done? I mean, that's still a moral consequence. You're either going to do it or you're not. And as you and I talk to our clients all the time, the last thing you want to do, and this is part of the motivational part of being a coach, is wake up the day after the contest and say, man, if I just would have done that, or I
Well,
could have
yeah.
tried a little harder, or I could have done this a little better. Like, no, like leave it all on the court and be that person. But again, that's an internal moral judgment. But here's what makes it tough, because I was talking about the structures in the brain that override biological impulse. This is a 24/7 thing. Whether you're a 60-year-old, executive trying to lose a few pounds, or you're a world champion competitive power lifter or anything else trying to make a weight class, uh, you are living contrary much of the day to those biological impulses. And there are now about almost 250 or so genes that are completely isolated and known that 100% lead to obesity, one person versus another, genetic changes, loci, location changes on genes, DNA strands. They just this last week found a kind of a master obesity gene that can kind of control others. And so up to 70% of the chances we have of being obese or not are purely genetic. But here's another context point that is so critical. In 1960, less than 5% of us were obese. Today, 40% of us are obese. Our genetics haven't changed that much in 2 generations. That takes thousands of years. What has changed is the food availability, the hyper, palatability of some of these ultra processed foods. The even the social norms, the fact that we're all on average moving about 1,000 calories less per day because we're sedentary. So all of those environmental things have changed. Our genetics haven't changed. So how do we go from 2 to 5% obesity to 40? That's where we have to start to learn to override those impulses and use every tool at our disposal. You mentioned even satiety, eating the right foods that lead to that, meal spacing and timing. These are all objective scientific principles at our fingertips that we can use if we're willing. But I'm afraid the camp who is saying, oh, don't track things. That's so rigid. Oh, just, what's right. Just intuitively do this. Let's learn a couple habits. Let's do this. If you don't have that objectivity, then you just can't do it. And so here's another research article for you to consider, Austin, and I'd love your thoughts on this. I'm going to give you two. One was a diabetic study that was analyzed just to see, and this was interesting because it was almost like a social science experiment where they were using a little. So it was a specific mechanistic study, but epidemiologically they were looking at the results without it being a controlled randomized study. So let me explain that by this. I think around 150 or so type 2 diabetics in West Virginia were taken through a diabetic curriculum. So it was a 1 year, 22 session training, which is all lifestyle based. So they're all getting coached by a registered dietitian. They actually had a health coach assigned to them that they could message anytime they want and get advice. And it's, here's why exercise is important and food quality and this and that. And they gave them both a pedometer and a food journal. They didn't say, you guys are all on a diet, you're in this group, you're doing this, and you're in this group, you guys do this. It was not a controlled diet. It was just, we're going to take you through this 1 year diabetic program, lifestyle program, and then they retrospectively analyze some of the common denominators to success. One of those being they broke people up into people who tracked their food with their journals rarely, inconsistently, or consistently. And the people who track their food in their journal in any way, it could just be writing down notes. I had a Dr. Pepper, or protein, carbs, and fat. They tracked fewer than 2 days a week, less than 33% of the year. The mid group tracked about half the time. The consistent group tracked 5 out of 7 days a week on average. It could have been they tracked every day for 3 months and took a month off, but they averaged above 66%. They lost twice as much body fat without even trying, just because they had a more objective. Doesn't even matter that it was perfectly objective. It was just a more objective, more accountable way of looking at what they were consuming, which completely matches the long-term longitudinal weight loss registry study, what's been going on for probably about 30 years now. And it shows that among successful weight loss maintainers who lose weight and then keep it off, the number one common denominator is tracking. They track their food intake, they track their body weight, they stay tied to something objective, not because they feel rigid and imprisoned, but that's simply the reality that allows them the freedom to actually live their achieved results.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that study. I think with people, like when they get into the intuitive eating or just, trust your judgment, what you should be eating. I think a lot of people fall off and don't lose weight because, again, it's so, I guess, freeing for them. I understand people not wanting to feel guilty about eating foods. I understand. I don't want anyone to be like, oh my God, if I eat this, I'm gonna die. Like, I don't want that for anybody. But it leaves them without information and it leaves them without so much freedom. I know earlier, I was tripping over like rigidity, and like you said, like sometimes just having certain rigidity is a good thing because I eat the same breakfast every day and I have for years. And you use a great explanation is like we're not bound to that. So I understand why intuitive eating and certain free forms of eating exist. And I say that because it's like I understand, but that doesn't mean that that is going to be the best thing for you if your goal is to change your body composition. It's just not. Like, as evidenced by a lot of this research that we've been discussing, like, even if people track, right? Not saying they had to make a lot of change, but even if they track, they have lost more weight than those that just didn't really track at all. Maybe wrote down 1 day out of like 3 months, whatever. Because we have that objective information to see. We know what's going on. I also believe it's because of accountability. When you write things down, you're holding yourself more accountable. Like we just talked about earlier, like you're holding yourself accountable. And typically when people write things down, they are looking at what they're writing down. So it's making them start to think about, like I've been eating all of these foods and losing weight, or I've been eating all of this and I haven't really changed, much. Like maybe I need to make a change. It just gives us that information. So I think there's a world, crazy, maybe we should call it flexible dieting, where you can implement both things, where we can have some things that we enjoy and still have the objective information. And that's just why it works. The fascinating thing when I was looking up research to get ready for this podcast, like you, I found that same 2017 study that you discussed. But it was, yeah, there wasn't as much research, but the amount of research there always showed that those that tracked in some form, whether it was through an app or through writing things down in a notebook or whatever, saw more weight loss than those that didn't. And so it's just, as we said in the very beginning of this podcast, this is why we need research. This is why we need objective information. So we can help people, so we can help each other achieve our goals using this information. Now, if somebody doesn't have the best relationship with food, then that's something that needs to be addressed as well. But specifically discussing, weight loss, contest prep, building muscle, like we know when we have objective information to track and follow, we can see more success than just shooting at the hip.
Mhm. And I want to finish with a really strong application point that does blend the two things together. And I hope I'm not conflating these studies, but there was another one in the Journal of Obesity where they looked at Weight Watchers, app users, the digital app, and they wanted to see, if somebody loses 3% of their body weight or 5 or 10 different categorical ways that in nutrition research, they can say this is clinically significant or this is substantial, different categories of success outcomes. And they wanted to again see, is there a correlation? Is there a causal relationship between the amount that people track their food and the accuracy of that, the frequency of that, versus what they actually lose? And it's really, really funny to me because you can tell they had a bias going in. They wanted to be able to say, because they put it right in the title of the study, that you can lose a clinically significant amount of weight without tracking. And what they found is the group of people, when they retrospectively analyzed the data, and the people who lost 3% of their body weight, they only tracked something like 28% of the time. So wow, you don't have to track that much at all, and you can lose a clinically significant portion. But then the people who lost 5% of their body weight, they tracked about 48%, 49% of the time. The people who lost 10%, triple, 300% more weight, they tracked greater than, I think it was 79 or 80% of the time. So again, they were just consistent. So can you lose weight without tracking? Sure, you can. Can you lose 3 times the amount of weight tracking? Yes, you can, because of that accountability and that objectivity. But again, I come back to the fact that that is not the goal for the rest of your life. That is not the goal. Those of you who are competitive athletes, physique sport athletes, you're just going to do it. You're going to get the job done. It's objective. You want the win. You have the will to do that. You're going to do it. What about the rest of your life when you don't have that external goal? Then you got to sit back and say, okay, now who am I going to be? Who is that moral person inside me tied to an intrinsic value of health and longevity, or even just aesthetically being functional and mobile? You're going to get to that point in your careers where competing is distantly in the rearview mirror, and to have those internal moorings is very important. And I think if you consider it now, which you talked about a lot beautifully, Austin, will help even those of us in physique sport who can be super objective understand those who are not, those who we may be coaching, in the general population. They just don't interact with food the way we do. And so to help them see, well, you don't have to be that perfect, but let's just take these steps. If you track 30% of the time, you can lose this much weight. Or maybe we'll do it one step at a time. How about we track 5 days a week and you just kind of let your weekends be untracked, but keep that goal in mind. It's not where you're going to go binge. Just, keep that goal in mind. Let's see how we do. Maybe we track all of these foods and even set up a tentative meal plan. And then dinners every night is something that's not planned, but, use common sense. Let's work on lifestyle habit changes there. So we start to merge the objective and the non-objective. These are just different ways you can consider using flexible dieting, because tracking macros is a part of flexible dieting. It makes it a more objective, accurate part, but it is simply eating the foods you want, which is freedom, in the amounts you need, which is objective, and staying aligned with your health values, which is that internal compass of who you want to be. Any final thoughts, Austin?
No, I was just going to add, I mean, I fall into the category you said as well. Like as a competitor, I mean, I'm going to be on. It doesn't matter. Like I have a goal, I have something I'm going to achieve. Even in the off season, we've hung out plenty of times. Like I will track, but also I understand that there's just things like I want to do and memories where I'm not going to stress out if I'm a little bit over my goals. Like I'm not training for a show at that point, right? For me, I like to always track something. I just like having those numbers. I'll probably do that the rest of my life. But I'm not tied to, oh, I'm going to go have a cheeseburger with Joe today. Like I will do the best I can, kind of have an idea. If I'm a little over, so be it. I can correct it the next day. Not a big deal for me. So for the athletes that are listening, like I've been competing for 17 years. Like, I know I don't have many more years left. I love coaching. I plan on competing again soon. I think when you get to that point as a competitor, and like you just said, like what's your identity afterwards? It's okay to still track and still live a bodybuilding lifestyle, but what's going to happen when you're not tied to that specific goal? How can you have that balance of like you are still eating healthy, you're eating the foods you enjoy, but you're having sense of what you're eating. It's an important thing to consider. And I'm not talking about people like, oh, I should think about life after competing. Like if you're in the heart of competing, be in the heart of competing. I coach people all the time for physique shows. I still compete actively myself, but at the same time, there is a beautiful transition of like, okay, like I'm going to track food, but I'm not going to stress out if I'm a little bit over because I can correct it the next day. Like when you can unlock that cheat code, you will realize that a lot of people sometimes the reason they don't see results is because of the amount of stress they put on themselves by fixating on those numbers. We need those numbers. They help us. We need consistency if we're trying to reach that certain goal. But if we're trying to eat just healthy, we don't have to be as hard on ourselves. Again, we still need to track and find that consistency. But I guess I'm just trying to say, that's kind of a way that I've went about it in these last few years myself, as you just nicely put. So, yeah, I hope that this was helpful for a lot of our viewers.
Yeah, they are all just tools for us to use. And don't get hung up on being in one camp or the other, one extreme or the other. It's like building a strong wall that doesn't fall down. You need bricks, that's structure. You need mortar, that's flexibility. You get to use what you want when you want it to achieve your goals. So yes, all the objective elements of nutrition are there. We have to find a way to make them fit our goals and our objectives and our lifestyle. So thank you again, Austin. Hope that helps you guys in our contest prep university universe, especially here in our Peak Intel series. We will see you guys next time.